Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Jerome Powell Day. In fact, we have a lot of news to go over here on this channel in this video with obviously Jerome Powell, but Trump also did a couple different press conference-like speeches today. Bunch of comments coming out from the Middle East, some that sound good, some that sound not as good. That definitely did have an impact on markets. Now, keep in mind, today is Wednesday, tomorrow is Thursday. Markets are closed tomorrow. So despite that, and despite what I would call an incompetent Fed, stocks did nothing today. The S&P did nothing today. It was down 5 cents on the day. You're currently up 45 cents in after hours on the SPY. Now, why that's a good thing is typically, like, if you're heading into a day in which there's a lot of uncertainty out there, we just had a Fed meeting that wasn't exactly super great, you would normally expect to see a lot of hedge fund and institutional selling pressure on markets into the end of the day. You didn't really get that as much as I would have expected to see. I would call that positive. Now, ladies and gentlemen, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. If you have also not checked out that link down below in the description of this video for the trading community, check that out. And really what we're doing over there is putting in the work, putting in the grind to find the companies that are hidden gems under the radar. Okay, APLD, Nebius, Novartis, these were all companies recently that went up 3 to 5x in value that were hidden gems at one point. Those were the companies that I, was putting thousands and thousands of dollars into before they skyrocketed, okay? We're doing that, again, with more companies. Hidden gems. What a hidden gem is really information disparity, where, call it real estate, right? Most people have the same information, but not always, okay? If you look at a house, it's a 3-bedroom house, 2-bathroom house. That is information parity. Both parties know exactly what the square footage is, all of that. But one party may know that there is gold under that house, and one party may not. Okay? We're trying to find the quote-unquote houses with gold under them that nobody knows about yet. Now, these are smaller cap companies in nature. A lot of them are $1 billion, $2 billion in market cap, sometimes even less, they just don't have the analyst coverage. They don't have the investor base that keeps up with them. A lot of these are companies that you can even see that reflective in lower average trading volumes, okay? I don't think these companies are going to be hidden gems forever. That's the kind of work that we are doing every single day. And I share my alerts, I share my trades when I make them, the investments that I make when I make them. It's not financial advice, it's what I am doing, and that is where I think the most opportunity is right now. Okay? To turn smaller amounts of money into a lot of money. There's a lot of names that are high quality that are just underlooked. And that is what we are doing. So check that out if that sounds interesting, sounds like something you want to be a part of. Link down below in the description of this video. Nonetheless, let's get started. And let me just give you a brief rundown. Okay, we're going to look at the dot plot here in just a second. The Fed is pretty incompetent at this point. Okay, at least the dot plot itself shows a fair degree of incompetency because we haven't seen inflation. The Fed's basically saying, hey, we're going to get inflation. So they raised their estimates again for inflation. But they did keep their projected 2 rate cuts this year. So none of it makes a whole lot of sense. And Jerome Powell on the podium today was pretty neutral. Like, nothing really changed from Powell's previous stance. Like, he says, hey, we are expecting to see inflation, but we may not see inflation, or it may be smaller levels of inflation than we expect. He says that maybe the tariff outlook changes. Like, a lot of what he said at the last Fed meeting was reiterated today. And long story short, Fed Jerome Powell says, because he was asked by one of the reporters that says, if you look at the data right now, it suggests you should be cutting rates. And Powell says, not really. He says that monetary policy is forward-looking. He referenced 2020, where the Fed took rates to zero before anything happened because they knew something big was about to happen. He says that the Fed must be forward-looking. And with that forward-looking, they're expecting inflation. But the economy's holding up. He says you could say the labor market is weakening a little bit around the edges, but largely it's holding up. And the economy is holding up, which does not warrant rate cuts when they're expecting inflation to appear. It's a mess, okay? I wish the Fed was more competent, but unfortunately, this is the hand that markets have been dealt. Double Line Capital's Jeffrey Gunlock says he believes that it's more likely that the Fed will cut interest rates towards the end of this year and into 2026. Donald Trump says on Iran that we are looking for total victory and no nuclear weapon. Trump says it's possible that fighting is necessary to block Iran's nuclear capabilities. Trump says my supporters don't want to see Iran get a nuclear weapon. Trump says that a deal could happen with Iran that he would have preferred to have an agreement versus the conflict. And believe it or not, that is why markets, I think, sold off following the Fed conference. It almost looked like stocks were selling off because of what Powell said, but I think it was some of those Iran comments about the U.S. getting involved, no deal, that maybe had a little bit of a negative effect on markets at the same time. And Trump says on acting against Fordo, the nuclear facility that is deep underground, this is where we believe, the U.S. and Israel believe, most of the enriched uranium that is at a high enough grade to be used in a nuclear weapon is stored. It's underground. This is where the bunker buster bombs would have to be used. Trump says that he has not made a decision. Powell says that certainly a rate hike is not the base case at all. And Trump says he thinks Iran was a few weeks away from having a nuclear weapon, and that if Iran had a nuclear weapon, he believes they would use it. Fed Powell says it's a time of real change in geopolitics, trade, immigration, and doesn't change how we do monetary policy. Powell says, of course, the Fed is watching the Israel-Iran conflict. We possibly will see higher energy prices, but don't generally tend to have lasting effects on inflation. And Trump says again that Iran wants to come to the White House. I may do that. Powell says that the economy is not signaling economic pain ahead, that tariff impacts are still uncertain, and some costs to hit consumers. The labor market is not pressing for a rate cut. The Fed to shrink headcount by 10% without hurting core functions, stresses importance of economic data, and calls for continued investment in public insight. Powell says that business people are working their way through this. It feels more positive than it did 3 months ago. Fed Powell, when asked if Americans should expect pain in the second half of this year, says, quote, "I'm not saying that at all." Powell says in the fall, we will talk more in detail about changes to communications. And the Fed says we expect a meaningful amount of inflation in the coming months. And Powell says we will make a smarter decision if we wait a couple of months. Powell says that they can take time to see how large inflation effects will be. Powell says the split in projections may also reflect differences in assessments of risk. Powell says it's likely that we will get to a place where rate cuts are appropriate. And he says we're going to learn more about tariffs over the summer. Powell says no one holds rate path projections with a great deal of conviction. And he says we can make a case for any of the rate paths in the projections. Powell says we can't assume inflation will just move up and then back down as projections show. The funny thing is, the Fed is assuming that inflation will move up in the first place. That is an assumption. We have not seen that in any of the data so far. That is why I'm calling the Fed incompetent in this video. They're assuming we're going to get inflation. Powell says it takes time for tariffs to work through the end consumer. And basically what he said here was if you're buying things at Walmart, let's say, if you go out and buy a lamp or a water bottle or something, it was probably imported into the country a couple months ago. So it's not necessarily impacted by the tariffs that you've seen on April 2nd, or a lot of the goods are not. As the months go on and some tariff goods come into the country, that's when you will see more of the inflationary effects. But I don't think I buy that. I don't see inflation coming. If anything, I see if prices rise, people buy less. That is inflationary and disinflationary at the same time. I think the two cancel each other out in a weak consumer environment. In a weak consumer environment, people don't just look at prices going up and say, okay, fine, I'll pay it. No, they look at prices going up and they say, oh yeah, I'm going to skip that. And when people start skipping out on buying a product, companies take the margin hit. They figure out how to become more profitable internally so they can keep prices low and preserve margins. Now let's get into this summary of economic projections. And let me tell you right now, it's confirmed. The Fed is incompetent. They are compromised. I don't know, like, if they're really just this bad at forecasting monetary policy, or like there's some ulterior kind of motivation here. But look at these numbers on the dot plot. They lowered GDP forecast. Who cares? Even though that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, given Q1 GDP was already well known, the last summary of economic projections on March 19th, we knew we were going to have a negative Q1 GDP report. They already lowered estimates from, that March projection, and they lowered estimates again. Kind of weird. Again, considering Q2 GDP is tracking at like 3.5%, fine. The unemployment rate, they raised that from 4.4% to 4.5%, fine. Headline PCE inflation, they raised their target from 2.7% to 3%. Okay. Core PCE, they raised their target from 2.8% to 3.1%. Let me tell you how asinine this actually is. Since March, you have not seen inflation go up. Since March 19th, the last SEP, you have seen inflation come down every month. Every single month. There's been no indication of inflation at all. And they just raised their year-end target on PCE by 0.3%. And there's been no inflation. The Fed is incompetent. You got to give it to Trump on this one. I think Trump, some of the comments he makes about the Fed is probably taking it a little too easy on the Fed, because this one is really just like a complete head scratcher. They are going out on a limb. There's no economic data that suggests we're seeing inflation or going to see inflation, but they're just going out on a limb saying, hey, we're expecting inflation. We're going to get inflation. When the fact of the matter is, we're not getting inflation. I know this sounds crazy to even explain. Like, why would you raise your forecast for inflation when you had the catalyst and 2 months have passed and there's no inflation? I know, sounds crazy. The, I guess, positive news out of this is the Fed kept their federal funds rate projections for 2025 at 3.9%, which, again, is kind of questionable if they really expect inflation to be higher, unemployment relatively unchanged, a little bit higher there, and GDP slightly lower. They're still expecting to cut rates twice this year? Okay, that's fine. That's bullish for markets. But kind of questionable as well. Now, in the actual statement that came out, there wasn't a whole lot that changed, but here is what kind of changed, okay? It says, the committee seeks to achieve maximum employment and inflation at the rate of 2% over the longer run. Right here. Uncertainty about the economic outlook has diminished, but remains elevated. The committee is attentive to risks to both sides of the dual mandate. That is different. Uncertainty about the economic outlook has diminished, but remains elevated. Donald Trump reiterates that the Fed should cut rates. He says that Fed Chair Powell is, quote, not a smart guy. Trump says If the Fed would lower rates, we would buy debt for a lot less. Trump says that Fed Powell has done a poor job and that the Fed needs to cut about 2 percentage points. So take the federal funds rate from about 4.5% down to 2.5%, which would be in line with where current PCE inflation levels are at. Like, Trump is not wrong here. Powell does need to cut about 2%. Trump says, I will wait until Powell gets out, then go long term. He says, I'm going to go very short term, get rates way down, and then go long term. So basically, US debt, how we finance the deficit, or really just capital in general, besides taxation, is sell treasuries. Okay, so what Trump's saying is the government's going to sell a lot of short-term treasuries right now. And then once they get rates that are way down, they'll lock in some of the longer term, like more 20-year, 30-year bond auctions when rates go down a lot. Which, I mean, we'll see if that happens. Donald Trump says that he can't say whether the U.S. will strike Iran or not. Donald Trump says Iran should have negotiated. And he says that Iran wants to negotiate, that they have actually reached out and they want to come to the White House. Trump says Iran wants to negotiate. Why didn't they before? But he says that nothing is too late. And Donald Trump says Iran in general sounds a lot different now than they did a week ago. Trump on Iran says, I don't know how much longer it's going to go on. Iran is totally defenseless. Trump clarifies that unconditional surrender means that I've had it, no more. Donald Trump says that next week is going to be very big, maybe less than a week. Donald Trump says that Apple is going to buy a lot of Trump gold cards. And Trump says that his patience for Iran has already run out. And kind of gave a pretty ominous warning to Iran's leader just by suggesting good luck. And Trump told Israel's Netanyahu to keep going. And Trump asked if he gave Iran an ultimatum. Trump answers and says, you could say so. And Donald Trump says, we're taking care of the debt ceiling issue. And it was rumored earlier today that an Iranian delegation for negotiation may have landed in Oman, but it doesn't look like that is true. Consumers' expectations for inflation dropped in May for the first time in 2025, per Bloomberg Intelligence. Iran's mission to the UN on X says Iran does not negotiate under duress, and we shall not accept peace under duress. And it looks like a third aircraft carrier is being prepared to be deployed to the CENTCOM region. Noriel, quote, Dr. Doom Rubini believes the U.S. is no longer headed for a recession, but instead a period of huge investments. The Iranian deputy foreign minister says Iran will respond if the U.S. joins Israel's war with Iran. Israel believes the United States will join the attack on Iran and the Fordo nuclear facility. Again, they need those bombs, those 30,000-pound bombs. They fall 200 feet into the ground before detonating. That's the bomb that you need to take out these nuclear facilities that are deep underground. And there is some unconfirmed reports that there is heavy U.S. jet activity after an unusual Iranian missile launch over Iraq and Syria with Brits that are also airborne. And there are some videos coming out which looks like this is the missile, which I believe that could be like a sound barrier shockwave radiating from that. That would explain why there is maybe some U.S. jets in the air. Could be a supersonic missile, something that travels at like 6 times the speed of sound. And a senior Iranian official says Iran's actions against maritime targets and enemy positions will be an option if America enters the confrontation, which could be an issue for energy if you start to see like oil tankers that get blown up in the Strait of Hormuz. That could definitely slow down traffic and create a little bit of a supply issue. And last but not least, we had initial jobless claims today. I failed to cover that earlier in the video. That's my apologies. That came out at 245,000. The estimate was 255,000, and last week was revised up from 248,000 to 250,000. So this was a pretty good number, still on the elevated side, still on the high side, but lower than expected. Okay, so that was a little bit of good news as well today for the labor market, but obviously the Trump headlines, Middle East situation, and the Fed was a little bit more pressing to cover first. So let me know your thoughts on all of this down below in the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great rest of your day. Now we'll see you in the next one.